This weekend was one of the biggest races of the year. The Qatar no, it was actually the Bathurst 1000. The race where GM and Ford fans go to a mountain in New South Wales and have a fight. And in the middle, a motor race breaks out. And it's one of my favourite races. Touring cars going up a mountain, down the other side, and it's basically an overlap of touring cars, endurance racing and GT3 racing, given how the cars are now versus how they were 20 or 30 years ago. It's a unique combination in motorsport at one of the world's greatest racetracks, and my favourite racetrack of them all. The scenery of the Hungaroring, the zero room for error of Monaco, the twistiness, camber and bumps of the Nürburgring, and in the first and second sectors, the top speeds of Spa or Monza. It's like multiple racetracks dropped onto the side of a mountain and 161 laps of the circuit to add up to that 1,000 kilometre mark. But this year, Bogan Christmas had the shine taken off it due to a bunch of rows that have been happening behind the scenes in Supercars and have been happening for the entire season, and that is to do with the P word. That P word being parity. Parity is a bit like BOP, but at the same time, it isn't. Parity in V8 supercars and similar series exists so that neither car is inherently better than the other, or others if there are more than two. The designs of these cars is done in such a way that only the body shapes are different and that the cars produce as equal as possible levels of drag, downforce and so on. The cars this year have had their critics, and earlier this year I did an opinion piece on how Shane van Gisbergen had been told to keep his mouth shut after he defended some of his colleagues when they were saying the cars were no fun to drive and were burning the tyres. Ford has had this issue where they had to detune their engines slightly to bring them on par with the engines in the Camaros. As Ryan Walkinshaw explained on Twitter, the detune has resulted in a stuttering effect in a certain part of the rev range, and has also caused downshifting problems and torque delivery issues on acceleration, which is affecting rear tyre life. Ford and supercars have been trying to fix it, but it's not going well, and this is in part due to the Ford using a smaller engine than the Camaro. The Ford is a 5.4 litre V8 engine with 4 camshafts and 4 valves per cylinder, while the Camaro uses a 5.7 litre single camshaft engine. Before this, it was 5 litre across the board, same construction, easier to work with. There's probably some other underlying issues, but I'm on the other side of the planet. And having done some extra googling over the last few days, it seems that just before Bathurst, Ford was due to get a leg up, for want of a better phrase. They were going to be getting a new aerodynamic package that would greatly help them when it came to tackling the mountain. This would have involved the Mustangs getting some extra help with downforce, which would help in corners such as the 3 left turns over the top of the mountain between Reed Park and McPhillamy Park, and would also have helped through the S's and down to the Dipper. But on the eve of the first practice session, Supercar said, no, you're not getting this aero package, which was already made and was ready to go, ready to be bolted onto the cars. And this got Ford a bit hot and bothered. Supercars has a way of working with parity. They call it a parity trigger, and it's done through analysis of lap times, but the overall process is a bit more complicated than that. Once this trigger is triggered, either 5 times in 8 races or in 5 consecutive races, then they have to look into it. In a basic sense, if they see that one car has a distinct advantage in a certain place, like in a straight line, they can then say, okay, maybe we'll detune the engine, or we'll put a restrictor on, or we'll put some extra drag on, or, a bit like how BOP works in endurance racing. And parity, like BOP, is used in part to keep costs down. It basically stops one or all the manufacturers just pumping money into the category and creating an environment where one model is much faster than the others, resulting in all the teams just using the same car because that's the fastest one. And this used to happen a lot back in the days of multiple chassis suppliers in junior categories. If Lola dominated one season, the following season all the teams that could afford to switch had a Lola. Then Reynard would have the best one, so they'd all switch again. Nowadays, you just have to join an iRacing lobby or do LFM on Assetto Corsa Competizione to see this in action. Oh, yay, great, another race and it's all McLarens. Yawn. Through parity, the cars are made to be as exact in terms of performance as possible, even if the shapes are different. While BOP allows for manufacturers to have all their interesting supercar shapes with their different engine configurations and layouts, it means that a Ferrari can have a turbo V8, Porsche can have a rear-mounted flat 6, Audi can have their V10 and Bentley can have something the size of the Death Star and still be competitive. Then each car has its own strengths and weaknesses on track that are reeled in slightly to stop one car being more overpowered than others. So what it means in terms of supercars, it means that the Ford and the Camaro will produce the same amount of downforce, they'll have similar torque values, they'll have similar engine power, and they will be as close as they can possibly be while having totally different body shapes. And then they'll use the same tyres, same rims, same brakes, same shocks and other bits and pieces just to try and keep the cost down a little bit more. They're basically the same car, but they're not, and everybody is also buying stuff at the same price. The last time Supercars had a parity dispute was 2019, when the Gen 2 Mustang came into the series against the aging Holden Commodore. After dominating the opening part of the season, Supercars made changes to clip the Mustang's downforce and allowed a gurney flap on the Commodore to bring them both in line, with the changes allowing for a more balanced field through 2020, 21 and 22. The difference is there was way more parity stuff happening in 2019 compared to today. So Supercars backtracked on any potential error upgrades for the 4 teams just before the biggest race of the season at the Bathurst 1000, and the 4 teams, in response, issued this statement. Following ongoing analysis, Supercars, in conjunction with its independent CFD partner D2H Group, have acknowledged that there continues to be a disparity between the Gen 3 Ford Mustang and Chevrolet Camaro. Therefore, technical parity has still not been achieved. Unfortunately, the proposed aerodynamic changes to the Ford Mustang, which have been acknowledged by all parties involved to reduce the delta between the two models, will not be implemented for the Bathurst 1000 this weekend. The independent data shows that the Mustang will be at a continued disadvantage for the biggest race of the year, which we believe is unacceptable and not what our sport is built on. While disappointed in the situation, every Ford team will be doing their utmost this weekend. It's what the fans deserve, it's what our partners deserve, and it's what the great race deserves. We will continue working together to correct the imbalance going forward, but now our attention turns to on track, respecting the challenge that the mountain provides. And I agree with them, and that's with my Ford hat not just off, but in a fire pit. Yes, I'm a Ford fan. The Bathurst 1000 is one of the world's greatest races, and it's probably as famous for the fact that it's Ford versus GM more than the actual race. People go there to watch Ford versus GM. And if the Fords are disadvantaged and will struggle to keep up with the Camaros, and this would be the same if it was the other way around, it knocks the shine off things. You've got the biggest event on your calendar devalued. The best part about the Bathurst 1000 is that you don't know who's going to win, and it can produce some absolutely insane results. Chaz Mostert winning from the back of the grid, ironically, in a Ford back in 2014. But you look at it this year, and you just knew that one of the Camaros was going to win. It was a case of which one? And then that starts causing problems. Bathurst is a bit like Spa in a way, 2 fast power sections with a downforcey bit in the middle. You need a car that can do both, and when it came to the top 10 shootouts, 6 Fords were able to get into the top 10, so the car can't be that bad, right? But it's not like the Mustang is a second a lap slower. The issue is that the Camaro is pretty much going to win every single time. Ford has only won 2 races all season. The first was at the Newcastle 500, but that was because of a disqualification, and the only on-track victory has come at Townsville. And that's not saying that Ford has done nothing wrong all season. They did kind of drop the ball at sundown. Cam Waters, driving the Monster Energy car, was finding that his car was struggling in a straight line. It could keep up in the toe of the car in front, but when it was out of slipstreaming range, it struggled. Conversely, Van Gisbergen and other Chevrolet drivers were saying that they were struggling for straight line speed as well. But you know how it is. Do a bit of sandbagging and no one will have to change. One of the big problems that Supercars had with testing these cars pre-season or in the development phase is that they didn't put them through a wind tunnel. The BOP or parity with the aero was done by just running them in a straight line, which doesn't work. The other thing is that rulebook is very, I don't know what you want to say, but the rulebook is quite clear. It has to be triggered at a certain point to trigger these parity reviews. And because it's come outside of the parity review window, GM has to approve it, and they didn't. As one person wrote, the farce is that some teams were trying to push for a performance upgrade. The farce is that Supercars hinted that they might allow the upgrade. The farce is that other teams have said, oh no you don't, and then there are arguments from both sides. Ford needs a boost, but Chevrolet only wants it if the triggers laid out in the rulebook have been met. It's a legal minefield with lawyers drawn at 50 paces. But all this is doing is getting fans worked up, and looking at their favourite form of motorsport and asking what the actual point is. There is a long-running meme, conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, that Supercars at its core is rigged in GM's favour, especially when it was Holden. It's further perpetuated when one of the people on the Gen 3 car design team is Mark Scaife, a Holden lifer. Is the Ford the equivalent of Luca Badoer's 40 versus Damon Hill's Williams? Not at all. The actual difference between the two cars is probably 0.2, if that. Doesn't sound like a lot, but over a race distance, it adds up, and the Fords are having to overdrive and destroy their tyres just to keep up. But when you've got no chance of catching the Chevrolets in front, it doesn't matter if you're in the top 10 come the race end at Bathurst or not. You've got no chance of beating them. So this is going to lead Ford to go, well, what's the point in us being here? Because Ford isn't in Supercars or any motorsport for the love of the sport. It's there because it's business. Ford, as explained by Torque Cafe, is involved in NASCAR, the WRC, NHRA drag racing, has a GT3 and GT4 program on the go, and will be back in Formula 1 with Red Bull in a few years' time. But then you've got Supercars, which is as far from Detroit as it can possibly be. If it's not competitive, then the business decision will be, what's the point in putting money into it if we can't compete? There's also the wording to take note of. It's not so much aren't competing, it's can't compete. And if Ford decides at the end of 2024 to pull its factory support and pull all the funding entirely, and it's already running on a slightly reduced sort of funding program, if you want to call it that, then GM isn't really going to have much to do. And you've got a car that's been part designed by the series, and then all the other teams are going to go, right, we're not getting any funding from Ford, so we'll just buy Camaros or Camaros. I'm just alternating between the pronunciation. It will become the GM Cup, and then Supercars loses its main selling point. There was like a mini cool age in Supercars. Ford, Holden, Mercedes, Nissan and Volvo all on the grid. 5 manufacturers, but the sports seemingly kept looking at the Fords and the Holdens and that was it. Volvo did okay with Gary Rogers, and maybe any leg up that it got was because the Volvo was popular, but the Nissans kept sliding back with no support and they left entirely at the end of 2019. As it stands, Supercars is not attracting any OEMs into the category. Nobody. It's Ford versus GM, and that's it. Nissan could, in theory, have brought back the GTR under Gen 3, but they're not interested. Kia and the Stinger was something that was pitched but never came to fruition, and Kia doesn't even make that car anymore. What it's starting to look like, and this is what it looks like from many, many thousands of miles away, is that Supercars is starting to turn into an old boys club. The amount of Holden guys that are involved with the punditry and all that stuff is quite worrying. And the only reason that Mark Larkham, who was a Ford lifer, is on the broadcast is because people like him. It's starting to get sort of whiffs of this is how it was in the old days and we need to keep it that way. It's a similar problem that IndyCar is having. When a series that is all about the equalness of the cars, despite them being different shapes, doesn't have that equalness, you run into a potentially dangerous situation of losing one of the competitors because the rules of business will dictate that it's an unnecessary expense. And that's the bit that needs reiterating. It's not that Ford isn't competing, it's that it can't. That's the bit that's annoying them, the teams, and the drivers. Because at the end of it all, it's a competition, and they want to win. They want a return on investment. Supercars has gone down a weird hole lately. You watch a broadcast or some highlights package and it's just bland, dull. It's gone the same way Formula 1 has since it went behind the paywalls. It's also corporate. Everyone seems to be towing a company line. And this is something I talked about earlier in the year with SVG's comments about the cars. Don't say nasty things about our car, it'll hurt our feelings. Others online have been saying this as well. They're not happy with the way the show is being run. If you take, for example, the Ruben Diaz goal that was disallowed for Liverpool against Tottenham Hotspur last week, it was quite clearly onside. It caused a massive uproar and people weren't happy. You had fans, pundits, players, everybody saying their opinion on this particular thing. It doesn't mean that we hate football, it means that we want what's best for football. Same way the BTCC ditched ballast for this season and we saw Ash Sutton and, ironically, Ford dominate. People are saying we need to bring back the ballast because it made the BTCC cool, it made it unpredictable. It doesn't mean that we hate the BTCC, it means that we just want what's best for our beloved touring car series. And actually, it's a good thing that I delayed the video on this until today instead of doing it on Monday, because in the last 24 hours or so, Supercars has now decided that the aero upgrades to the Fords that were supposed to come for Bathurst will now be in place for the next round on the Gold Coast. There's 3 rounds left of the season. A day late and $1 short is the phrase a lot of people are using, and it also looks like they finally bothered to rent out a wind tunnel to test it properly this time, instead of running it up a runway and asking Shano what the drag coefficient was. The only hope is that Supercars takes a good look at this and listens to the drivers, to the teams, to the manufacturers, and most importantly, the fans. Otherwise, the category could go the same way that DTM did and become just yet another standard issue GT3 series, or go the way the British touring cars did in the early 2000s with, well, maybe that's a video for another day. So then, opinions on the parity issues at Supercars, the reasons for the complaints, and what this might mean for Supercars as a whole going forward. If this thing has made you think things about the thing, like this thing so the algorithm can do its thing, and hit the subscribe button thing so you get notified of anything that I do here. Massive thanks to the kind folk at Patreon and the channel members who help the channel at a more personal level, and if you want to help out, there's a Patreon link in the description, along with a link to the F1 Store affiliate, and then the join button and the super thanks button are underneath this video. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.